A couple weeks ago, we committed the worst crime that you possibly can on Twitter. We said that there is intra-community racism in the plural community. We'd been planning to make this video a lot later, but we kind of had this on our mind after that. So today we're here to try to unpack race, plurality, and how the plural and dissociative communities are around that. For a bit of context on what happened, this will not be a surprise, I don't think, but basically, I made this extremely basic tweet. It basically boils down to, you can pause to read it if you want to, but it boils down to the plural community has a racism problem. The plural community does not support creators of color. This includes system Twitter and dissocia Twitter. And that last line made a lot of white people very angry. I do also want to say up front, before anyone gets too confused, I know how I look. I know I'm very pale. I am Latino and Native American. I'm just really pale. Part of it's because I'm chronically ill. Part of it's because I'm just never outside. My iron is probably low. And I just don't have a lot of melanin to begin with. Also, this is really bad lighting. I don't know why I set it up like this. It's nighttime. Anyway, Twitter got mad. And dissocia Twitter was especially mad, which is to be expected because dissocia Twitter is... I'm going to refrain from calling it terrible, but I will say that was the first word that came to mind. The majority of the reaction I got was a direct reply to the effect of course the dissocia twit community doesn't show up for plurals of color, it isn't for you. Which, while I understand dissocia twit isn't for all plurals, that is one of the most racist responses you can have, actually. You say that the lesbian community doesn't show up for gays of color, and someone says, that's because the lesbian community isn't for gays. That's still bad. That's still very bad. It's a very bad approach to liberation, first off, because it's not like dissociative system liberation can occur without plural liberation. Not that the people acting like this really want to see plural liberation happen, but I digress. And also, I don't know, I think that the fact that a ton of the dissocia twit community is in fact plural, and a lot of those people are people of color, should be reason enough to support plurals of color, but what do I know? The other thing that happened was someone basically making that remark, but by subtweeting me out of context. Because their goal was to, discredit a person of color saying, this is racist. Which again, is a weird priority to have when you're not even being personally called racist. Someone's just saying, there is racism here. It's kind of, it's giving telling on yourself. It's giving it's about you. I didn't know it was about you, but you knew it was about you, and now you want me to know I was talking about you, you know? So, that was kind of a debacle. There was also the issue of pretty much everyone in support also subtweeted us, and those people were often just kind of white, which, while we do appreciate the support, just kind of as a general rule of thumb, if you are talking about race inspired by something a person of color said about race, it's best to just reference back to the person of color unless they say, hey, please don't link to me, because I'll be harassed. I expect a resurgence in people being little bitches. No, am I allowed to say that on our YouTube channel? I'm getting a yes. So, if people are probably going to be little bitches about it again, because I post mean YouTube video and call them racist. So, if that does happen, which it likely will, I would appreciate this time tagging us. This isn't like a call out. I don't care that much. It was just like a pet peeve. And also just a very annoying week. Just a very annoying week. I want it to be clear that I do not care about your opinions on race if you are a white person, and I especially do not care about your opinion on whether or not you specifically are racist. Thanks. Now that we've taken out the trash, let's move on to actually discuss race and plurality, because there's a lot to it. One thing you've probably noticed in the plural community is that the plural community really likes to use non-white experiences of plurality as a shield against ableism and that kind of rhetoric. But that's kind of the only time plurals of color are actually brought up as a group. In debates about non-dissociative plurality, that is basically plurality without dissociative identity disorder and OSDD1, because there are other forms of dissociative plurality that are not included in DID and OSDD1. White plurals really love to point out that the DSM has an exception in pretty much every dissociative disorders criteria to like dissociative experiences that are better attributed to a spiritual practice than to just general dissociation. I do want to note, because a lot of people do not know this, that spiritual plurality can absolutely qualify as dissociative identity disorder. This is why we read the whole entry in the DSM before we post about it. The DSM does specifically acknowledge that some presentations of DID just do look like marginalized spiritual practices. This is part of why the DID criteria is kind of messed up. But also, it does mean that someone experiencing their plurality as possession can also have dissociative identity disorder. So, specifically, what's pointed out there is that the DSM does make an exception for plurality that is better explained by a spiritual practice if it is not also better explained by dissociation on top of that. And specifically, in this case, people like to cite tulpomancy, ritual possession practices, and shamanism. So my little brain teaser here is, when was the last time you heard any of those three brought up in plural spaces outside of how it relates to white plurals? The white is important there, because I know you've probably heard about tulpomancy in relation to white plurals, but that doesn't count. You've probably heard and even taken part in discussions about tulpas and tulpomancy. If you're not sure what that is, there's an explanation on the screen right here. You can pause to read it. But you probably don't know much, if anything, about their history beyond what validates white tulpomancy. Most tulpomancy history that people do know boils down to, it's from Tibetan Buddhism, kind of. It was brought into white culture by a white woman who allegedly had a very good relationship with the Tibetan Buddhists. Allegedly here isn't meant to be passive-aggressive, it's just unallegedly. But she was a white woman, brought it back, now it's been transformed kind of into a different practice. And that is, like, the history of it, kind of. But that's the history of how it got into the white community. Do you see what I mean? For example, you probably don't know that the original term, when transliterated to English, is spelled like this and not like this. Much less the original term or the role that it played in Tibetan Buddhism. That's also not mentioning the debate on whether the white usage of the term is appropriate to begin with, which I'm not qualified to make a statement on, beyond noting that there are definitely not many Tibetan Buddhists in the modern community, much less with large platforms, as opposed to white people. Actually, if you could name me a single Tibetan Buddhist in the community with more than 50 followers, I would be surprised. In terms of spiritual practices with connections to plurality, usually they're just very vaguely mentioned. Frankly, I haven't seen a single spiritual or cultural plural of color with a significantly sized platform, or really any white plurals paying that topic much notice. Most plurals, if pressed, can't name anything beyond demonic possession, tulpomancy, maybe some form of divination, and the vague concept of Native American spirituality. I hope it's not a surprise to you that there's definitely more than that. One example there that's often missed out in favor of vague native spirituality is some natives' experience of being two-spirit. The masculine and feminine spirit, which is in quotes because those are still Western concepts, can be felt as their own beings for many two-spirit people. To use, again, the fairly white framework of plurality that we currently have, just because the plural community is very white dominated, the two spirits might be experienced as fragments or facets of a two-spirit individual. They do not need to be, but they can. Especially in cultures where two-spirit people play specific spiritual roles in their tribes, there may be an element of literal different beings in one body. I do want to put a disclaimer, though, that this is far from a universal two-spirit experience, and while we are Native American, we are not two-spirit. A more common plural, or at least plural-adjacent experience that's very common with Black, African, and Indigenous cultures is having the spirits of one ancestors inside yourself to some degree, metaphorically, but sometimes a little bit more literally. We tend to have a much deeper and more spiritual connection to our blood and cultural ancestors, and it's kind of hard to explain to people who don't live like that. It's especially hard to explain how you feel that connection when you can't trace back your family tree that far, as many Black, Indigenous, and African people can't. The best I can come up with there is just saying that our people before us fought with everything inside them to give us our future, and a large part of that was keeping our traditions and passing them down and creating pieces of culture and heritage to bring back what we lost, or just sort of, you know, grow our people again. Many people descended from natives or enslaved Africans have lost a lot of our people's culture from before colonization, and often the ability to know what culture that even was. But what we do have is the knowledge, culture, and strength of our ancestors to at least some degree, even if that's just by knowing they existed. And for us, that's often felt in the presence of their spirits or having their minds share our bodies too. Also, please do not ask deeper questions about my experience with this, especially if I do not know you. It makes me sad. I will not tell you, and it's also my business, and I do not intend to share it with non-natives. All that's to say, there's a lot of ways that plurals of color exist in a framework of plurality that just isn't white plurality. And there's a lot of ways that we experience plurality that are just totally ignored by the broader plural community, especially when they aren't relevant to the broader plural community. By broader plural community, I again mean white, because the majority of the plural community, as it is right now, is white. The plural community specifically refers to those who identify themselves as plural, much like the queer community is those who identify themselves as queer. And in that plural community, the environment is not super welcoming to plurals of color, and is also not super focused on bringing in plurals of color or recognizing our experience, or even just helping us recognize our own. One thing that's also often just kind of ignored in plural circles is specifically how race intersects with neurodivergence and plurality in a social context, beyond vague statements about, for example, how psychiatry is racist, which it is. It is racist, but usually psychiatry is racist is thrown into reasons why psychiatry as an industry needs to be abolished, as opposed to tackling that specific subject and how racism in psychiatry interacts with plural people. One thing that people don't really consider with plurals of color is that, for example, when we present with disordered plurality, we are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, or bipolar disorder than our white counterparts. This is basically because dissociative disorders are generally, by the psychiatric industry, considered to be victim disorders. I put that in quotes because that's not how this works. I hope we all know that's not how this works. But I'm speaking to the ableist perspective of psychiatry, not really how this actually works. This is how it works in terms of diagnoses and social stigma. So, dissociative disorders, trauma disorders, anxiety disorders, some mood disorders are generally considered to be in the victim category. Generally, what this means is that people on the victim category side are assumed to be weaker, suffering, victims This side is often what white people are diagnosed with because white people in the realm of psychiatry are generally considered to be the victims of the mental illness. They're considered to be infected with a defect, I guess, a defect in white supremacy. Oh, autism is also on this side, and ADHD, pretty much any learning disorder, aside from conduct and oppositional defiant disorder, is on this side. However, on the other side, we have the perpetrator side. The perpetrator side includes schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, bipolar, I want to say bipolar 1. But basically, the thing on the perpetrator side is that people with these disorders are assumed to be aggressive, inherently more likely to be abusive. This is also where substance abuse disorders go. These are the people who, you assume that someone has this disorder when they're yelling in public type things. So if you've been like wearing a thinking hat, you've noticed that a lot of the stereotypes associated with these disorders are associated with people of color, especially Black, Latino, and Indigenous people. You might also be noting, for example, that oppositional defiant disorder is extremely commonly associated with Black children, and that substance abuse disorders are so associated with Native Americans that it's an entire genre of comedy. So, with that in mind, it should be noted that people of color are very unlikely to actually be diagnosed with a dissociative disorder off the bat. We are just generally statistically way more likely to be misdiagnosed, but also to be misdiagnosed with a violent disorder. Again, none of the disorders on this side make you violent or a worse person. Some of the worst people in my life have had general anxiety, and the best people in my life have been schizophrenics. But that's not what clinicians are thinking when they diagnose you with them. That's not what racist clinicians think they are. And especially because the disorders on this side are extremely commonly weaponized to incarcerate people of color and also to displace us or displace our family from us. Yeah, it's a bit loaded. And it's especially a bit loaded to deny us our positions in the plural community, especially if we attribute our plurality to one of these disorders, just because we are not diagnosed with this disorder, which people only really think white people can have, and especially thin white women with no anger issues. Do you get what I mean? Not in terms of dissociative diagnosis, but in my experience, for example, as a Latin person and also looked less white than I do now, also, the body's name at the time was extremely non-white. The body's name right now is also non-white, but my name is Crow, so, I was having autistic meltdowns constantly, and instead of even having an autism assessment or ADHD assessment considered, especially when I was very obviously struggling in school due to attention deficits and being unable to shift attention from my special interests, I instead got assessed for oppositional defiant disorder and taught anger management skills. I will say, I did not really have anger management issues that much until I was taught anger management. It turns out being taught anger management for just experiencing distress does give you anger to manage. So, did it work? No, it didn't. It was abusive and traumatic. But the point there is, for example, my brother, who is more white passing than I am, he was kind of just immediately clocked as a certified autism. There was a lot that goes into that, but the point here is basically that less white kid who is very clearly not cis, no one ever thought I was cis, is immediately clocked as oppositional defiant. White presenting guy who really likes trains, immediately diagnosed with autism. This is something that we all kind of understand and will recognize. But the plural community fails to understand and recognize this also happens with dissociative disorders, and it happens all the time. Coercive diagnosis is a huge issue in the plural community. Just kind of in general, a lot of people in the plural community are traumatically diagnosed with a dissociative disorder or with the schizophrenia spectrum disorder. But, again, think about who is usually traumatically diagnosed with the schizophrenia. I haven't run the statistics on this, but I have a very strong suspicion that the majority of plurals who were coercively diagnosed with schizophrenia are in fact Black and Latino. I know this fact because most people who are coercively diagnosed with schizophrenia tend to be Black and Latino, or at least disproportionately Black and Latino. And yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you've thought of that before, have you? I mean, I hadn't for a while, and I'm kind of very directly affected, so. But one thing I can say is that this is exactly why we do not make assumptions. This is why, though, we have to stop having every prominent member of the plural community be a white person. There are a lot of very productive white members of the plural community, but that doesn't matter because white people are just not going to see certain things. White people aren't going to see certain things, and white people definitely can't speak to certain things. And so long as, you know, we're only platforming white people, our community is going to have a white supremacy problem. Our community is going to have a racism problem, and we can either deal with it or we can get defensive that you misread a tweet as calling you plural instead of having dissociative identity disorder, you know? Like, that's kind of a priorities thing there, where it's like, you know, I don't personally really like to be called an alter, but if someone says people need to stop dehumanizing alters, I'm not gonna go, actually, I'm not an alter. How fucking dare you dehumanize alters more? You know what I mean? Like, I can say, please don't call me an alter, but I can't say people should dehumanize alters because this isn't about them. I also want to say that the way non-white people mask is different. It's fundamentally very different. And again, the main framework most people will understand this from is autistic people. Autistic people of color have been saying it for a while, and in the autistic community, we have a little bit more traction, a little bit more acknowledgement at least, that for us, masking is done not to not be seen as weird, but to not be seen as violent. We do not stim near police officers, because if we stim, we may be deemed violent. For a lot of us, the concept that masking is a privilege is deemed extremely offensive because actually the privilege is the choice. If we can't mask, we can't go out in public. On my end, I can mask less in public because most people will assume I am white. I am clockable as non-white, especially in person, but most people will just assume I'm white based on my vibe. I can usually stim in public if I don't see an officer around, if I'm not too loud, and if I'm not too obstructive, because I'm still a very visibly disabled, very visibly trans person, and that does not get treated with a lot of kindness. But I'm also very aware that the second I have to hand over my ID, I am going to be outed as specifically the kind of trans that I am, and as a Latino. And if they run my stuff, if they look up my parents, they will see that I am the child of two very Latino parents who also look very Latino and who are immigrants. But the point is, once a police officer has put me in the system, I am also fucked. I am fucked in a way that white people are not. I'm not just fucked in the sense that I'm probably outed as trans. I am also fucked in the sense that, for example, if they decide to charge me with a crime, that could put my direct relatives at risk of deportation. And, you know, I'm less likely to be stopped because they won't assume I'm white. But if I, for example, am talking to my headmates in public and not masking it well enough, if I am distracted, if I have a switch in public and begin suddenly acting very differently because it's, you know, one of my headmates, especially if it's one of my headmates who can't socially mask very well as, you know, friendly, which some of us have problems with, I am much more likely to have an officer called on me. And what happens after that is very dangerous. And again, it is dangerous for everyone. But the danger of an officer deciding they don't want your family in the country is different. And that's not to mention that, for example, if you're visibly non-white or easily clockable as non-white, which I also sometimes am, but if you, for example, don't have the privilege of just giving a white name so you're not followed in a sundown town, you're extra fucked. There's this trick that's talked about a bit, usually offhand in plural spaces. It's not super often, but it does come up where if you're someone who benefits from speaking out loud to your headmates in public, you can pretend to be talking on the phone. This is good, kind of. But this assumes you're a person who can have a loud phone conversation without being stopped. I can assure you that someone who is read as a Black or Latino man having a loud phone conversation with their headmates, especially if someone clocks that they're not actually on the phone, is not safe. I can assure you that no one who is perceived as non-white is really that safe doing it. And that's kind of, the thing. Tips for plurals, tips for closeted plurals, communities, just kind of even just like our memes, assume you're white. And there's this idea in the plural community that plurality just kind of is white. Plurality is white plurality. White plural terms are plural terms. They don't consider that, for example, origin labels are mostly white terms. Non-white plurals often are not in the mainstream plural community and are even less likely to be in the plural micro-label community, partly because the plural micro-label community is connected to the Mogai community, which is also very racist, but that's a topic for another day. The terms are kind of assumed to be universal experiences and often just kind of non-consensually applied to other experiences. Some people will just, for example, use the label tulpagenic to refer to all tulpamancy, ignoring that Tibetan Buddhism does not have system origin labels, and that is in fact kind of stupid. Even terminology like alter. Again, the term alter comes into the community from dissociative diagnoses, which plurals of color don't have that much access to. When you're a plural diagnosed with schizophrenia, your alters, your headmates, are voices. They're people. They are not called alters for you. And they will not be called alters for you unless you get an accurate diagnosis or decide to do that yourself, which again assumes that you get a warm enough welcome in the plural and dissociative community to even find out that you can use that term, to feel comfortable using that term, and to want to align yourself with that very white community. My problem solving here is simple and not a thing in my control. Because really, what'll help the most here is really just more people following more plurals of color. More of those plurals of color need to not look like me. I promise you, if you think you are following people for the quality of their content and all the people you're following are white, you're not actually doing that. And that's not entirely your fault, because algorithms intentionally suppress people who aren't white. But it does mean you can't say it's not a race thing. I promise you, white people are not that much better at content creation than people of color. I'm not better at content creation even than most people who are not as white passing as I am. But yeah, I promise you, there are creators of color whose content you're gonna like, and you might even like it more, partly because a lot of the stuff you like was probably intentionally or unintentionally lifted from our culture anyway. It's like people who say Eminem's the best rapper. It's like, okay, buddy. It's Childish Gambino, but okay. Please don't start a flame war in my comments about who the best rapper is, especially not about Eminem. I do not want to moderate comments about Eminem, okay? The only Eminem I want in here is they. Jesus fuck, what am I saying? Okay. My point is basically just follow non-white people and you're probably racist. I don't have credits to roll, but if I did, I would be rolling them over this. This has been Crow of the Safety Pin System in Abadi et al. And please don't be racist in the comments. You'll really hurt my feelings. Bye.